Warami Mitiga. Hello friends. Budrina Junior Dharug Nurawa. Good to see you on Dharug country. Welcome to 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's audio walk at Pitt Town Lagoon. Naya Giara Rhiannon. My name's Rhiannon.
Naya Giara Lyra. My name's Lyra.
Bayawu Budri Dharug Urian. We speak well of the Dharug people.
Lyra, Wilberforce, Dharug Dharug, the people that we belong to on Dharug country.
Bayajinun Gulbanga Gununigang Yura Guragao Yagu Barabugu Dharug Yura. We pay respects to our elders, past, present and emerging.
Nalaya Warming Inyini Dharug Nuragu. We welcome you to Dharug country.
Yanawiju Manubiwa Muru Warungad. Walk with us in the footsteps of our ancestors. Naraji Dabu Wamili Dyarubbin Gu Waraja Muru Badu. Listen to the story of our Dyarubbin and the lagoons, creeks and waterways that feed her. This river is our ancestor, a living, breathing being, sung into existence from creation. The river holds our dreaming, creation stories and song lines, a sacred highway connecting us across countries and nations. Dyarubbin carries a shared creation story of Gurungaj, Maribara, the great eel. Remember Mitiga, tread softly on this dreaming.
We were strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this audio walk contains stories of historical violence and Aboriginal people now resting in the dreaming. Listen and enjoy the stories, but please do not reproduce them in any way. Thank you.
Gui Yanma. Before we walk into the reserve, let's walk to the grassy end of Church Street, to where we can look out over the lagoon. From where the road turns from gravel to grass, there's an open view of Pitt Town Lagoon to the south, looking out over the neighbouring horse paddocks on our left as we're looking downhill. Pitt Town Nature Reserve was dedicated in 1976 to protect Pitt Town Lagoon, preserving the wetland as an important sanctuary and breeding ground for over 73 species of water birds. Pitt Town Nature Reserve covers an area of 46 hectares. It's a seasonal lagoon and, depending on rainfall, often has low water levels in summer, transforming to an expanse of water in winter. Pitt Town Lagoon is on Dyarubbin's floodplain and is one of the few remaining lagoons that were once abundant in this area. Emeritus Professor of History at the University of New South Wales, Grace Karskens.
All along Dyarubbin, on both sides of the river, there are many lagoons still today, but 200 years ago there were many more. They stretched like a necklace of mirrors right along the banks of the river. They're actually really ancient bodies of water because they're the water left behind in the swales after the river slowed and narrowed and deepened over millennia. And then of course they become really ecologically rich places. They attract lots of food plants, lots of animals and bird life and water creatures like turtles and platypus, eels, fish. And so of course they are also people magnets. They're such rich places. They are the places where Aboriginal people, right up and down the east coast of Australia, it's where they gathered and where they camped, where they harvested and fished. There was plenty of food for everybody. They would have been good places for many people to come together for corroborees or for contests where the law was enacted.
At its closest point, Dyarubbin, the Hawkesbury River, is about 600 metres beyond the lagoon. Looking west, or slightly across the horse paddocks on the right side of the grassy road if you're facing downhill. It then swings around to the north or further to the right.
Bardenarang, artist and educator, Leanne Watson, who is my nanny.
The lagoons, I've always thought they're really important because to me they're full of medicine and resources, and they sort of stand out to me as women's places. Even right across the Cumberland Plain, like all of our creeks, a lot of them are chains of ponds as well, so they're like water holes. So that's why I tend to paint chains of ponds or water holes or lagoons. The waterhole formations are really common. And then along the river, next to the river, the lagoons are like big medicine places.
My name's Dr. Michelle Ryan. I'm a lecturer in ecology and environmental science at Western Sydney University, and I am the Hawkesbury Nepean waterkeeper. Wetlands play a really important role cleaning water for us. Water comes into the wetlands, and the wetlands function as kind of the kidneys of the river, so they will clean up the water before it then flows onto a river system. Different types of plants in the wetlands, the sediment, so the soil in the wetlands, and the microbes and the water bugs and everything that lives in it plays a role in removing things like excess nutrients, which will help those wetland plants grow. Slows down the flow of water, so the water will flow slowly. It allows for sediment, so silt and mud, to drop out and go to the bottom of the wetland. So that helps clean up the water before it goes into the river. Wetlands provide habitat for a huge number of species. So turtles, eels, other fish species, water bugs. And in the Hawkesbury, we're really lucky that we have a lot of migratory birds that come and make the Hawkesbury home for part of a season. So those wetlands are extremely important.
Bardenarang Creek flows out of Pitt Town Lagoon through a small gully to the north, or to our right as we're looking downhill. Bardenarang means little water. It's one of the few waterways on Dyarubbin that retains its original name. A tree line marks out its course, as it meanders across the floodplain for about 3 kilometres before reaching the river north of us. Archaeological work on the river in 2014, just downstream of the Bardenarang confluence, revealed artefact deposits of silkrete, mudstone and tuff, dating the presence of Aboriginal people here to 36,000 years.
We only had a handful of names for places along Dyarubbin until a fantastic discovery in the Mitchell Library in Sydney in 2017 was Reverend McGarvie's list of native names for the Hawkesbury. And on that list are 178 Dharug and Darkinjung names for Dyarubbin, the Hawkesbury River. The McGarvie list names 25 lagoons, from Mari Mari in Richmond right down to Baroma, which was a once vast lagoon and wetland down at Sackville. A lot of them tell us something about the country, so they might be named for birds, like Biruma or Birama is a reference to the ducks that no doubt lived there. And to me that's so evocative because the ducks were in their millions on the lagoons here. That's one reason the white people loved it so much. They could just go out and shoot themselves a meal. These lagoons are so important in this story because they're like larders. There's birds, there's fish, there's yams, there's edible reed, water plants. And there are even different names related to the word for lagoon. Warecha, Warang, Warade, Warakia, which seem to describe the kind of lagoons that they were. So a double lagoon, a large lagoon, a long lagoon. And Gubayi, it seems to mean arm, which might suggest that the Dharug people thought of it as an arm of the river, which it originally was. So these names are fascinating because they really conjure up that lost geography that was really destroyed in the wake of colonisation. This really brings to mind a lost watery world where water just trickles and gushes and wells and pools in lagoons, wetlands and creeks and ponds along Dyarubbin. Unfortunately, over the decades, many settlers drained and destroyed the lagoons, mostly for grazing or for more agricultural land, to the point where today almost 80% of the lagoons along Dyarubbin have been destroyed or severely damaged.
I was part of the Dharug research team working on McGarvie's list. The Reverend John McGarvie was the minister here at Pitt Town and across the river at Ebenezer between 1826 and 1830. When he arrived, McGarvie initially stayed with settler family the Halls in their house, Percy's Place, on the river just northeast of Pitt Town. The area is still known to locals as Percy's Place. Our people called the area near the house Mir Gurabung, which we think means bee hole in a bloodwood tree. Gujung, native bees, like making their hives in bloodwood trees, and the hole through which they enter the nest is known in many Aboriginal languages as the eye. Perhaps there was good honey to be found in that area. Percy's Place is on a narrow headland, with the river winding around it. Our people called it Gujana, meaning finger. It became known by settlers as Hall's Point.
To me, all the lagoons are really important, and I love how the language it's brought back, how we had explained all of these different places as parts of the body, shows the connection that we had to those places. I've got to look at the landscape around those lagoons too, because there's some of those that have got the higher points, and then you've got some of them that are near flatter areas. It's not just that lagoon alone, it's what's surrounding it or what was done at those places.
Many of the Aboriginal names McGarvie recorded on his list suggest that our people named places on the river as if they were parts of the body. Goodbye is a lagoon directly across the river from the mouth of Bardenarang Creek, on the Wangi Wilberforce side. Goodbye means river arm, suggesting that this lagoon was thought of as an arm of Dyarubbin. Many lagoons show the original course of the river. They are remaining channels or arms that the river left behind. Let's head down to the reserve entrance and walk through the gate, following the path till you reach the bridge over Bardenarang Creek.
Behind us, the township of Pitt Town sits above the floodplain on an old river terrace, an ancient floodplain formed by the river over millions of years.
I'm Kirsty Fryers. I'm a professor in the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University. I study the processes by which water shapes the Earth's surface. Well, over millions of years, the Hawkesbury catchment was part of Gondwana, so there were big sandbed river systems on the Gondwanan continent, and that created the Hawkesbury sandstone. So that's now the bedrock that is confining the Hawkesbury River. And inset within that, the gravels that sit in the bottom part of the valley, they're hundreds of thousands of years old, and they were deposited by a much more energetic river system. A bigger river, so the channel size was much bigger, but also the amount of water flowing through that landscape was a lot larger at that time, largely due to different climate. So I am really interested in the floodplain wetlands. There's different types of floodplain wetlands that we can see on the Hawkesbury and surrounding tributaries. First of all, you can have back swamps, like Pitt Town Lagoon. So they're those swampy areas that sit quite a distance away from the channel, but right up against the bedrock valley side. This is where floodwaters will go out and dissipate over that floodplain and deposit the fine-grained materials further away from the channel. And then they create these sort of swampy wetland types of conditions. And then there's other ones that are called cut-offs. So that's when a meander bend gets cut through the neck. Cut-off will have a crescent shape, and it's an old meander bed. So the terraces are the old floodplains of those ancient rivers, probably comprised of those really cohesive gravels.
Pitt Town Lagoon is classified as a back swamp. This part of Dyarubbin has wide, fertile floodplains on each side of the channel, from Pitt Town on this side to Freeman's Reach on the other side, where you'll find Bushells Lagoon. Bushells is a large crescent-shaped lagoon, likely a cut-off, and feeds into the river via Buttsworth Creek, just upstream of Bardenarang Creek at Wangi, Wilberforce. This part of Dyarubbin's floodplain was where the first meeting between Dharug leaders Gombury and Yarramundi and Governor Phillip took place in April 1791, near Bardenarang Creek, on Phillip's second expedition to the river. We'll stop when we reach the bridge over Bardenarang Creek.
The history-changing expedition was in April 1791, and there's about 40 people in the group marching across country from Parramatta, and they have with them as guides two coastal Aboriginal men, Colby and Balluderi. So Colby is a quite important leader. Balluderi is a younger man from Parramatta.
Local historian and author of Hawkesbury Settlement Revealed, Jan Barclay Jack.
They were walking along quite close to the river edge when some Aboriginal men in canoes drew alongside of them.
A native from his canoe entered into conversation with us and, immediately after, paddled to us with a frankness and confidence which surprised everyone. He was a man of middle age with an open, cheerful countenance marked with the smallpox. He seemed to be neither astonished or terrified at our appearance and number. 2 stone hatchets and 2 spears he took from his canoe and presented to the governor, who, in return for his courteous generosity, gave him 2 of our hatchets and some bread, which was new to him, for he knew not its use, but kept looking at it, until Colby shewed him what to do, when he eat it without hesitation. We pursued our course, and to accommodate us, our new acquaintance pointed out a path and walked at the head of us. A canoe, also with a man and a boy in it, kept gently paddling abreast of us. Taken on the spot by Captain Watkin Tench. A complete account of the settlement at Port Jackson.
And the curiosity and the patience was there from both cultures, and they saw and heard them conversing with their women and children who were on the northern side of the river. They exchanged gifts. That established a good rapport, and they ended up camping with them on the bank near Bardenarang Creek, which is in today's Pitt Town area.
The ease with which these people behaved among us strangers was as conspicuous as unexpected. They seated themselves at our fire, partook of our biscuit and pork, and heard our guns going off around them without betraying any symptom of fear, distrust, or surprise.
And by the end of the night, everybody sleeps round a fire together. And Yalamundi has his little boy with him, Jimba. Tench is watching them sleeping, and then Yalamundi carefully turns over and carefully puts the child next to him again and cuddles him around the fire. It's very rare that you get a little glimpse of the past like that, that's very intimate. Well, it was a very positive meeting. It's just so tragic that it's also a turning point which led to such a disaster for the Dharug and Darkinjung people on the river. But it started out well. There was friendship and trust, and stories were exchanged, and people slept in peace. I just imagine this as a fire-lit globe in the darkness alongside that river, that long ago night.
On this floodplain area we now know as Pitt Town Bottoms, between the lagoon and the river, was also the place where settlement began 3 years later in early 1794. Without any negotiation with our people, a group of 22 settlers and their families established farms along the river with the lagoon behind them.
So after that expedition, I think news about this river and the Aboriginal people there being friendly would have travelled like wildfire through the whole of the colony. Then in 1794, things start to take a turn for what we would have to call an invasion. From an Aboriginal point of view, you can't describe it any other way. A band of about 20 people come from the earlier settlements on the east coast, and they go to what is now called Pitt Town Bottoms, and they start clearing a bit, spread themselves along that reach, and start putting in wheat and corn. It soon became pretty obvious that you didn't have to work as hard on a farm on the river as you did in some of the other areas. Word got out in the community, and more people. It was the first land rush, 400 within a few months. Can you imagine the impact on the local landscapes, the paths that you're using, your ceremonial sites? Everything would have been more and more disrupted.
Let's continue along the path now towards the bird hide, the building beside the lagoon. Dharug and Darkinjung people fished from the shore or from canoes, Naui, using multi-pronged mudung, spears, or with gurrajung, fishing lines spun from various fibre plants such as the kurringy tree. Fish would have been easier to catch from the lagoons as they dried out, which this lagoon did seasonally.
Lyra, place with eelnets, was one of our people's places on a slight bend in the river on the other side of Pitt Town Lagoon. Women made string and nets, so it's likely that this part of the river was a women's zone, with this lagoon being rich with food and medicine.
When the settlers arrived, water birds on the lagoons would have been an easy meal, especially for those with guns. But with increasing numbers of colonisers moving into the area, the pressure on our people's food supply would have made conflict inevitable.
In each of the killings of Aboriginal people in those first years and their retaliation, there's evidence that the conflict over food sources was really basic to it. The first one is a reported shooting of somebody on what was called the race ground, which was a kangaroo hunting site. So again, it was the Europeans taking the Aboriginal food.
This was April 1794, just months after the colonisers' arrival. The race ground was a rich hunting and gathering ground and camping place for our people, not far from here.
It's not only the taking of land, it's also because they broke all kinds of moral laws. They stole women and raped them. They stole Aboriginal children, mostly babies and toddlers. And that's the worst grief ever. And I think it's been underestimated in historical accounts. This constant law breaking is causing them to be punished under Aboriginal law.
At the end of 1794, the first recorded massacre of Aboriginal people in modern Australian history took place on the lowlands between today's Windsor and Richmond. In May 1795, Dharug and Darkinjung warriors appeared to strategically attack the most outlying farms on the river. These included those of Webb, Wilson and Thorpe on Canning Reach near Caddie Creek, just downstream of Pitt Town. In 1796, across the river at Bushells Lagoon on Freeman's Reach, the Hines brothers were speared to death almost as soon as they had arrived to take up their farm. Following this, Governor Hunter ordered settlers to come to each other's aid whenever they were under attack. Settlers were also forbidden to have Aboriginal people staying on their farms. By law at this time, Aboriginal people were only to be attacked in self-defence, but this was not always the case. Downstream at Sackville in 1796, our warriors successfully drove settlers away. Pitt Town Nature Reserve is managed by the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, primarily as a habitat for water birds. Let's head into the bird hide now, where we can look out over the lagoon. Mark Fuller is a bird watcher who frequents the wetlands and waterways of the Cumberland Plain across Sydney's west.
Because of all the rain, because of all the extra higher water levels, there's not so many birds. They sort of all disperse and move out. And you go from this thing of having the water and then the edge, you lose that muddy, variable depth that you get. It's typically Australian. When places fill up and then empty and fill up and empty, it's that ephemeral nature that really generates the high invertebrates and the high biodiversity. So that's what our birds really like. And they travel far and wide, because as soon as conditions are right, they appear from out of nowhere, and as soon as they change, they go off to who knows where. Things like bar-tailed godwits and the sandpipers, they breed up in Siberia, and then they'll come down, stop off maybe in China or Korea, and then they'll get to Sydney and some will go on to New Zealand. He's a wading bird, and this is another interesting thing with wading birds, is that the amount of water depth depends on the length of their legs and the length of their bill. So sometimes it comes down to centimetres or millimetres as to whether or not something's too deep for them or whether it's too shallow, and it's got to have those invertebrates there as well. And then the vegetation makes a difference. And I've seen where a restoration project will put loads of trees in an area. That's not what waders want. They want an open area that they can come in after their long flight and just go straight in. And plus predators. If they've got an open area they can see from 1 kilometre or 500 metres away, they'll feel endangered by having a lot of vegetation around by them. They won't feel comfortable to stop and rest in that area.
Pitt Town Lagoon provides a distinctive type of habitat in the Hawkesbury district, being very shallow with aquatic vegetation on the margins.
More commonly sighted waterbirds include the dusky moorhen, the purple swamp hen, white-faced heron, royal spoonbill, Australian pelican and black-winged stilt.
As Mark mentioned, the lagoon is an important stopover for migratory species such as the Mongolian plover, Japanese snipe, marsh sandpiper, red-necked stint, great egret and glossy ibis. European carp are an introduced fish species found in the river and the lagoon. They compete with native species and contribute to the muddiness of the water and loss of aquatic vegetation. The first governor of the colony, Arthur Phillip, was authorised by the British government to grant the land our ancestors had lived on and tended for millennia to free settlers and ex-convicts who were willing to farm it. The group of 22 colonists that established themselves along the river on the other side of the lagoon perhaps chose this low-lying fertile land for its easy access to the river and the abundant bird life.
The British government had decided that ex-convicts whom they wanted to farm here so they didn't go back to Britain, they were entitled to 30 acres. Anybody who was married got another 20 acres for their wife, and we got 10 acres extra for the children. The first 22 settlers were around the mouth of South Creek and along what is now Pitt Town Bottoms. Mid-year of 1794, when a lot of their friends came up, they were wanting to keep in the same central reaches, so that's when the northern side of Wilberforce Reach began to be settled. Very quickly, the access all along the river was impeded. By 1799, you had something like 68 kilometres of river and creeks being settled, thickly in some places and sparsely in others.
It was quickly clear that the fertility of Dyarubbin's floodplain made for abundant crops, and soldiers and officers wanted in, claiming land grants for themselves. Soldier Thomas Bayliss received the first land grant on the lagoon itself in 1794, to the right of the lagoon as we look through the bird hide, or southwest. Initially, land in the area was planted with maize and wheat. Today, this land on which our people once grew yams is mostly turf farms, with very few fruit and vegetable farms remaining. Looking south, straight down the lagoon and just to the right, is where James Roos, the first to be granted land on the river, received another grant here on the lagoon in 1797, one of several land grants he received and went on to sell. Today, this is Linwood Golf Club. In his book, The Pioneers of Portland Head, Ronald Arndell reports that in 1798, Captain John Grono, the area's most well-known boat builder, purchased 30 acres near the lagoon at Bardenarang Creek, behind us to the northwest. The ex-convict grantee he purchased it from, James Ryan, farmed this for the captain for many years.
My name is Erin Wilkins. I am a Burrabrongal woman from my paternal grandfather. The river was part of our life. So the waterways give us our food, give us our livelihood. I made a transporting canoe. Everyday life was centralised around the river life for a lot of our people. The Hawkesbury Nepean had an abundance of yams, and they were a staple diet. We would dig them up, take what was needed, and then replant them down so that they could continue to grow. The way that we obtained our food was always in the thought of not to be greedy, not to take in excess. and to always leave it for future days ahead.
McGarvie recorded several names that our people had along the river in this area, once a rich food and medicine gathering ground. To the southwest, across the lagoon where the river bends to the north, was Narunganbai, grandmother's place, or place of the old women. Our senior women are held in high respect and have significant ceremonial roles. Just around the bend was Gulaibara, place with eel nets.
In February 1827, a Dharug couple fishing in the lagoon noticed Reverend McGarvie returning home from the church. Later he wrote in his diary,
They fish in the lagoon and sell the fish to the settlers for bread. As they find the fish readily, the lagoons are nearly dry.
Nets were also used to catch birds.
Along the river system, the men would line up with their boomerangs and the women would string nets across a bend in the river. So when ducks fly, they fly close to the water. So when you come round the bend, they can't see that quickly and they fly into the net. When you're in a lagoon, it's very, very different. They will encircle the lagoon and throw the boomerangs across the lagoon. And because the ducks can't go anywhere because they're encircled, the ducks push themselves under the water. It takes a lot of energy for a duck to push itself under the water because of the predator. And then they're exhausted and you can literally walk in there and grab them.
Here near Narunganbai, grandmother's place, I acknowledge my grandmother, Dharug elder Auntie Edna Watson. As a child in the 1930s and 40s, she heard her mother and grandfather speaking Dharug.
When they were growing up, my grandmother was terrified that the kids would be taken off her, so there was no language passed on. There's bits and pieces where my nan used to sing a lullaby to the kids in Dharug when they were going to bed. Mum was working at the university, going back a few years now, and a lady from Stradbroke Island was singing the lullaby in her language. When Mum heard it, she just started crying and was like, that's a song my mum used to sing. So we got the lady to come out and we recorded her singing it.
We've translated the lullaby back into Dharug, and you're listening to that now. With colonisation and intensive farming of this area, the land around the lagoon and along the river was cleared. Once it would have been covered with dugga or river flat forest. In 1804, around the same time our people petitioned the governor to leave them some places they could access the river, Governor King declared a number of commons in the area for small landholders to graze their stock above the river level and to retreat to in times of flood. Pitt Town, or Nelson Common, an area of 2,228 hectares, stretched from Arndale's Farm, now Caddie National Park, into Pitt Town and out to present-day Windsor Road.
McGarvie recorded our people's name for the Pitt Town Common area as Maramata, or a place with tracks. The common likely had many tracks passing through it, some of which would have been Dharug pathways.
In this bird hide, you might see in the rafters the remains of debris which collected here during major flooding in the early 2020s. If you like, you can head back outside the bird hide. There's a little table where you could sit. Where Bardenarang Creek meets the river, at the end of today's Punt Road, Governor Bligh, who succeeded King as governor, bought several land holdings on the river in 1807. Some oak trees planted at the time are known today as Bligh's Oaks. The land was managed for him by Andrew Thompson. Bligh was appointed by the British government in 1806 to control the use of rum as barter and end corruption among the military corps. In 1812, the first punt in the area to cross the river commenced operation where Bardenarang Creek meets the river, carrying passengers, animals and cargo across the river to Wilberforce. Michael Nowland ran the Pitt Town Punt, which was operating a few years before the punt in Windsor, which opened in 1814. The punt connected Governor Macquarie's newly planned 1810 villages of Pitt Town and Wilberforce across the river. Following the devastating floods of 1806 and 1809, Macquarie essentially granted lowland farmers an additional town block on higher ground, but most farmers refused to move off their farms and leave them unattended.
A woman and 2 children were rescued from the last stage of peril by a young man of the name Henry Fleming at a farm in the vicinity of Bardenarang. The water had flowed so rapidly in the place where she was as to attain the height of her neck, she at the same time holding her 2 children up in her arms and calling for help, when she was observed by the young man who swam to her relief. March 17, 1829, Sydney Gazette.
The punt enabled church parishes and police stations to be shared by the 2 communities across the river from one another. The river was the main road for settlers, as it had been for our people for millennia. The punt was an important crossing point for those downstream of Windsor and ran until 1921.
Up the road from the punt was the manse, Reverend McGarvie's home from 1828. McGarvie purchased the punt from James Davison Jr., determining it was not only too small for the traffic using it, but deteriorating badly. So McGarvie ordered a new punt to be built by local boat builder, Captain John Grono. Governor Darling granted Grono the services of 2 mechanics for 4 months, recognising its urgent need. Without it, settlers over the river and downstream of Wilberforce had to detour via the punt at Windsor, adding 12 miles to their journey to Sydney. A bell from the punt is on display at Hawkesbury Regional Museum. Our people's name for the manse farm area where McGarvie lived, near the confluence of Bardenarang Creek, may have been Nanumba. It was the address he used many times in the stories and poems he published in the Sydney Gazette. Nanumba probably derives from the word Narungbai, meaning old man, suggesting it was an old men's camp. It's just downstream of Narunganbai, grandmother's camp, on the river bend at Pitt Town Bottoms. Downstream from the Bardenarang confluence, the river bends around Goodjana, the finger-like point where Percy's place is, and then bends back into Canning Reach, just north of the township of Pitt Town. This is where free settler and sailor Captain John Grono was granted land, built his home and started farming and boat building in 1804. He was one of a handful of settlers in the area who between themselves built and established the Ebenezer Church, Australia's oldest surviving church, over the river and just downstream.
I'm Ted Brooks. I'm the son of Frederick Brooks, whose father was Matthew. Matthew's father was John Brooks, and John Brooks was the son of Captain Alexander Brooks and Margaret Grono. Margaret Grono's father was John Grono, Captain John. A lot of the farmers along the river had their own little boats, and they would cart their products down. Some used to go round to Sydney.
My name's Ted Brill. Came to Ebenezer in 1972 as principal of Ebenezer Public School. Grono was really interesting. He arrived in 1799 on the Buffalo. He had a working position on the ship. He brought his family with him, and obviously he was going to stay somewhere along the way, and he settled here.
My name is John Grono, and I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Captain John Grono, believed to be born in 1767 in Newport, Pembrokeshire, in Wales. He came to Australia on the Buffalo on the 5th Fleet. He got a job on the Francis, and that was in 1799. We were going up and down the Hawkesbury River.
John Grono came up to Hawkesbury, and that's where he met this John Kelly. He was a boat builder, yeah. He stayed there breeding cattle and all sorts of things.
He was granted the land in 1801. He started farming wheat.
He had land both sides of the river. He farmed there and he also built ships there.
In 1804, he was also making boats. He was on the Speedwell and he was going out to sea and he hit Lion Island. It was his schooner, the Speedwell. The wreck was bought by Andrew Thompson. With the loss of the boat, he was in a lot of financial trouble. So what he did, he thought, I'll go back to being a seafarer.
So he built the Governor Bligh. He built it for Andrew Thompson. Grono was going on trips over to the South Island in New Zealand and down Tasmania way, sailing all the time.
He became the captain of Governor Bligh, 1811. At one stage in the Bligh, he returned with 10,000 sealskins. And those sealskins were mainly made gloves and hats for women in London. One of the musters, what he was taking back that he had caught, was something like 20% of exports of New South Wales. He didn't get the money from the skins, he got the money from being a seafarer. So he went from strife to stable again. This is what I've heard through my family and what I've read.
He did a lot of exploration in New Zealand. He named a lot of points around the South Island. He got Windsor Strait, Elizabeth Island after his wife, Thompson Sound after Andrew Thompson.
He did name Bligh Sound, Caswell Sound and Milford Sound after Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire, in Wales.
He came to an island on the west coast where he found 10 men who had been left there to catch seals.
And that's where he discovered Alexander Brooks and his 9 mates in 1813.
They'd been there for 4 years because the ship sunk on the way back to Sydney and nobody knew where they were. He brought them back safely to the colony. 2 of those men married 2 of his daughters, Robert Mackenzie and Alexander Brooks.
And then Alexander stayed with him, married his daughter Margaret.
In 1818, he acquired the King's Arm at 1 Bligh Street, a pub in the city, and he sold that for £2,000, which was an absolute fortune back then. From that, he actually built the Elizabeth with that money that he got, and I think was then the Australian, which was 270 tonnes. So he actually built the 3 biggest in terms of weight wooden boats.
The launching of the Australian, the largest boat Grono built, was a celebrated occasion in March 1829.
She went off the stocks in great style amidst an assemblage of all the rank, youth and beauty of the surrounding districts. As it was known, the launch of the Australian would take place at the height of the spring tide. The people congregated at an early hour. A deafening shout was raised from every person present as she began to move from the station she had so long occupied. Sydney Gazette, 1829.
As the ship entered the water, a rope tied around a stump steadied the vessel to prevent it colliding with the opposite bank. The Australian took 2 years to build and was 30 metres long, 8 metres wide, drew 3 metres of water and weighed in at 270 tonnes. It was made of blue gum, blackbutt, iron bark and apple tree from Caddie Creek, Colo River and Pitt Town bottoms. Grono built at least 12 ships between 1804 and 1833. Most of them were considered large at the time, including the Governor Bligh, Elizabeth, Industry, Australian and the Governor Burke, which was the second largest at 200 tonnes. Building boats and sending them out to sea, sealing, whaling and transporting goods was big business on the Hawkesbury in the early days of the colony. But with the clearing of the riverbanks for farming, the river began to silt up, and by the end of the 19th century, big ships could no longer make it to Windsor. In 1819, Grono would have been one of the largest stock owners on the Hawkesbury. His cattle would have run on Nelson or Pitt Town Common, just across the road from his home.
And he was granted a lot of land, like up around Wiseman's Ferry. I think it was 2,500 acres, solely so he could get the timber to build them.
Made them out of gum trees. Caddie Creek and Webb's Creek, all those places they got timber from.
He had probably 17 people working on the properties, and some of them were Indigenous. And he paid properly, is what I've heard. From my understanding, he was relatively friendly to the Indigenous there. There were incidents upon his property. I don't know what those incidents were, but I know he was okay. He was like a quiet achiever. But he didn't make much money from the farming, he made it from the boats. When he died, I believe he was virtually intestate due to a very dodgy transfer of land and money. He got duped. I know my dad mentioned it. I don't think he had all the assets that he thought he had. I think it's part of it. But there are mysteries in this.
In his book, The Settlers of Portland Head, Ron Undell tells that once when Grono was sailing up the river, Aboriginal warriors threw spears at his boat from the high cliff of Portland Head. Grono ordered the cannon fired. The ball struck the cliff top and the warriors departed.
The group of Dharug people living on Dyarubbin around Pitt Town and Caddie were known as the Pitt Town or Caddie Creek Tribe. They were the Dharug people McGarvie first met, and they continued to live in this area over much of the 19th century.
Grace Karskens.
One of the most well-known Aboriginal men in the Caddie Pitt Town area was a man called Black Captain. His real name was Kurringy. He would have been born in that area about 1800, and he got to know the Grono family very well. Like a lot of other young men, Kurringy became a sailor who went on those sailing voyages. He was also noted as a very brave man because he could swim, and when one of the sailors fell overboard, dozens of people watched on helpless, and Kurringy dived in and saved the man. He also became a resistance fighter in the Frontier War on Dyarubbin. Kurringy was included on Governor Macquarie's list of most wanted resistance fighters, but he managed to survive the terrible months of killings and raids that happened in that year. Later, he became the leader of the group that still lived around this area, and he appears in all the blanket lists for those years. But in 1839, he was having trouble making ends meet. They just didn't have enough food, and so he submitted a petition to the governor asking for a boat because they couldn't get enough work from the local farmers. By this time, this group had been dispossessed of their best land, and yet they stayed with country, trying to make ends meet whatever way they could. And all the settlers wrote supporting statements saying how brave he is and what a good worker he is. Unfortunately, he didn't get the boat. And then we have no record of what happened to him or his group. Until 1864, there are 3 words in John Grono's diary during the flood and Black Captain. So the 3 words are referring to Kurringy, whose settler name was Black Captain because of his sailing experience, sheltering in the Grono household from the flood of that year. And then there's no mention of him until 1868, another flood year. And again, Black Captain is trying to help his people. He writes again to the governor, and he applies for a boat in the wake of the flood because again, there's no work, everything has been washed away. And his petition is refused. So they were very good at building up relationships with settlers, the ones they knew that could help them. It was quite smart, really. That's within the larger frame of the whole colonisation thing. I mean, they were forced into that.
Reverend McGarvie made at least 8 journeys overland along Dyarubbin and Gununday, the MacDonald River, to create the list of 178 Dharug and Darkinjung place names he recorded, between Murra, a lagoon near Richmond, and Wooloomurrung, Wiseman's Ferry. On the first page of McGarvie's list, beside the first word, is written the name Maria, which may have been the name of his Dharug guide. Perhaps it was my ancestor, Maria Locke, who walked along the river with him, pointing out the names of places which McGarvie wrote down.
This is a fabulous find held by the Mitchell Library, and I was amazed to come across it as I was doing some other research, because that kind of information is so rare. We have such a tiny proportion of Aboriginal names surviving on our maps today, and you know that every single corner, bend, reach of the river, every mountain, every hill, every main tree had a name. Reverend John McGarvie was a Presbyterian minister who arrived in 1826 and was sent straight out to the Hawkesbury. He lived in the manse at Pitt Town, and he did the services over at the Ebenezer Chapel, that wonderful old chapel. He's a scientifically minded man. He was really interested in insects, and someone collected a platypus and he dissected it and made notes. And I think they were already thinking the Aboriginal people will die out, because that's the white man and woman's historical idea. They think it's inevitable. The only good thing that came out of that was that they collected stuff, words or drawings of rock art, and they're precious, those things. The other really good thing about this list is the fact that he noted where some of them were. So he wrote down the name of the settler whose farm this name belonged to. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, we can actually reconnect them to places. And that's astonishing, because if we know the names, we can actually restore them. They may come back into use. Wow. And they're beautiful.
Some of the Dharug research team on McGarvie's list, Dharug knowledge holders Jasmine Seymour and Erin Wilkins.
For us to have those words back and on our lips and associated with real places, you have that window back into your culture. It's very, very powerful. And for us here, the McGarvie list has really shown us where we fit into the story of Indigenous Australia, and where we fit into the story of Sydney, and how we are connected to so many different mobs along this incredible river, and how it's not defined by land borders or nations. Very much that connectivity is more of the real story of us. And I think that's been extraordinary.
It's been amazing being able to connect knowledge and stories that have been sitting there waiting to be found and linked up again. Being able to access and actually see or visualise our people on country and what would they be doing, because we now know what that place was used for or what that place meant or how it was connected. It's goosebumps, it's emotional.
In March 1827, McGarvie noted in his diary that his Dharug friends
know all the water holes,
and they always made sure.
Water was at no great distance, although we knew nothing of it.
McGarvie marvelled at the birds, one time noting a dozen long-legged milk-white birds, perhaps egrets, in a lagoon.
This is a most beautiful bird, which flies in the company of 20 or 30 of its own species, flies about lagoons, majestic appearance.
Birdwatcher Mark Fuller.
Egrets are related to herons, and they can be a bit difficult to tell. A lot of it is the size of the bird, but also the length of the neck. The great egret's got a really long neck. His neck is longer than his body. And then the intermediate egret is a plumed. They used to be called plumed egrets. And then the little egret, he quite often is on his own, and he'll just hunt quite erratically, whereas this one will be more of a stalker. And cattle egret, as the name suggests, hangs around with cattle. Quite often you see them picking up insects around. And they're one that's done really well worldwide. Their numbers have exploded because of the cattle, because of us. This is what we find. The adaptable birds that have worked with us are all doing very well. But it's these birds that rely on habitat that we want, that land that we're grabbing.
Ex-convict Lawrence May was granted land on the river in 1800 at Bardenarang. He farmed successfully, at one point supplying 2,000 bushels of maize when Governor Macquarie called for grain to go into the stores to avert a crisis. He had one of the earliest horse-drawn flour mills in the area, had a leg amputated in 1819 due to infection, and lost a child to drowning following a freak hurricane-like storm that blew down his house. But by 1835, he had the first irrigation system perhaps in the colony, pumping water from the river around his farm.
In these awful seasons of drought, a Mr. Lawrence May, a respectable settler at Pitt Town, has had the courage to erect a pump for the purpose of irrigating his land. An experiment, we believe, unprecedented in the colony. The pump is placed on the margin of the river and conveys the water through leaden pipes into a ditch or trench, whence it is conducted at pleasure by means of furrows to any part of his farm. It is calculated that it will discharge 20 tonnes an hour and requires only 2 men to work it. We hope it will attract the earnest attention of those farmers who are in the vicinity of copious bodies of fresh water. Sydney Gazette, 1828.
In the Great Flood of 1867, the largest on record at 19 metres, the Reverend George McPhee was resident in the manse at Pitt Town. He had just married his daughter Mary to William Poole in the house. No flood had ever entered the manse before, so the wedding guests sat down for the wedding feast despite the encroaching floodwaters which continued to rise, forcing the wedding party to eventually be rescued by boat from the upstairs windows. Pitt Town Common, the vast, more than 2,000 hectare stretch of land between Caddie Creek and today's Windsor Road, had been set aside by Governor King in 1804 for grazing of stock. But by the 1850s, the primary use of Pitt Town Common was timber and firewood collection. In the 1890s, parts of the common began to be sold off as small acreages, with some land dedicated as a labour camp for destitute men and families, named Skyville Farm. Skyville later served as a training camp for British rural workers. During World War II, it was a military training camp. After World War II, Skyville became accommodation for migrants fleeing post-war Europe.
My name is Jen Dolan. I grew up in the Hawkesbury and continue to live here and be connected and think about the river. My mum, she's Ukrainian. My grandparents were from the Ukraine and were part of that big movement in Europe, so they were in the forced slave labour camps of World War II. After the Americans liberated the camps, they were 5 years waiting to find out their future, I guess. So they came out here on Polish passports and started a life here. My family were in camps for another 10 years. So they first landed in Melbourne and they moved through 4 camps, and Skyville here was the last camp for my mum. The migrant camps here, they were hard for my babushka and Jed, but for mum growing up, they just ran wild. They all spoke 5 languages before English. It was just a place of just running around on Anchorage. They had an amazing time. Yeah, I wrote this poem to acknowledge my mum and the stories that I grew up hearing about her life here and learning to swim, because Eastern Europeans don't have access to beaches. You know, that Australian mentality of swimming here was something they had to learn really quickly. River, Riechka, 1959. I can't exactly remember when the river was clear. Mum said it used to be when she was young. Biloko, Borisko, Selbulski and Slavinsky kids would sneak to the Hawkesbury River after school. European skins warmed by Australian sun. They learnt to swim in the dams at camp, then graduated to jumping off the pylons at Windsor Bridge. It was safe because you could see the bottom. English, 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 they were told, but the Eastern Bloc stuck together. Polish, Hungarian, German, Ukrainian and Latvian. Zika, Folio, Fluss, Riechka, Upu. The other local kids never acknowledged them, not at school, on the bus, nor at the river. After all, they were here first, don't you know?
Some of Dyarubbin's first people lived on Pitt Town Common and other local commons and large estates throughout the 1800s, finding ways to survive, as our country was divided, granted and sold, and our language and culture forced underground. In the 1890s, as Pitt Town Common was carved up, an Aboriginal reserve was established on the river downstream on Sackville Reach, on a narrow, steep stretch of the riverbank.
My name is Tamara Maisema ni Wilkins. I am a descendant of the Dharug tribe. My grandfather is Thomas Wilkins, whose father and mother were both from the Hawkesbury River. He would talk about going on the trip to see his grandfather and staying at his grandfather's farm. John Leonard Mitchell, who was an orchardist in Pitt Town and Windsor area. So I have all these great stories of my grandfather playing on the Hawkesbury. Nina Alice Barber was my great-great-grandmother. She was a child born and raised on Sackville Reach Reserve and then married a farmer named John Leonard Mitchell, who also lived in the area. They then had a child named Dulcie Mitchell, and that was my father's grandmother. She was a beautiful woman. She did not always identify as being Indigenous because she was scared. She knew she was Aboriginal and she told her children later on in life, but they used to suffer from extreme racism at that time. My grandfather talks about being called derogatory names as a child and coming home very upset, and his mum not knowing what to do about it in a time when, if you were Aboriginal, you didn't have rights. My grandfather Thomas, his father was also named Thomas, who was married to Dulcie, and his mother was Mary Williams, the son of Philip Williams, who was also an Indigenous man that lived on the Hawkesbury. I know that this is my country. My family have walked these lands for over 60,000 years, and I feel great strength in coming back to country and connecting and experiencing your land with no racism involved, which is amazing.
Following the breakup of Pitt Town Common in the 1890s, Pitt Town Lagoon remained as a wet common and continued to be used for grazing. In the 1950s, the lagoon was drained to create more pasture for grazing. In 1976, the lagoon was protected as Pitt Town Nature Reserve. However, 4 local residents were permitted to continue grazing the lagoon area until 1991. In 1985, several islands were created in the lagoon to enrich the habitat for water birds. Paperbark and casuarina were planted on the islands, and in 1993, 850 native trees and shrubs were planted on the northern side of the lagoon. Pitt Town Lagoon's importance is recognised by its listing on the Register of the National Estate. Across the river at Freeman's Reach is Bushell's Lagoon, where farmer Fred Smith lived from 1924. He was interviewed in 1992 by Sue Rosen, historian and author of Losing Ground, an environmental history of the Hawkesbury Nepean.
I was born in 1924 on what they call Bushell's Lagoon. The Hawkesbury River runs through Buttsworth Creek into that lagoon. When I was 6, my father started a dairy farm there. When I was about 7 or 8, I used to go over to the river with my father in the dray and all our milk cans, and we'd back the dray down into the water and we'd just dip it out in bucketfuls and fill the cans, and we'd bring it home, and that would be used for our drinking water, washing, for everything like. But the water was beautiful in those days. If we were working near the river, we just went and put our head in the water and had a drink. The lagoons all dried up. That was in 39-42. That was the biggest drought I've seen. I remember when the lagoons, and the river too, were just a mass of weed. Fish fern. It's what we call sags, a long spindly thing that grows up in the air. And that's where the red bills and the coots and all those things used to nest. and they just break a bit over like and just sit on top of it. That would have been about 1950 to 60, say. It was just a harbour, these areas around here, for wild duck and swan, literally thousands of swans, black swans. But now the lagoons, there's no weed, there's no nothing. It's all eaten out, I'd say, with the European carp. There was lily walkers, because the stilts used to come here and nest. They'd come in a drove, the stilts, and they'd fly over. And they couldn't get to the ground quick enough to make their nests. And they used to make the nests on the edge of the water, on these lilies that used to grow there. And there'd be little stilts everywhere, like in 3 weeks. And then when they were fully grown, away they'd all go. The quails were that thick here, and the last 10 or 15 years they've all gone. Yeah, we used to have the jabiru here. The mountain ducks, there was all sorts of ducks. But now all you get's the black duck and the wood duck. There's been that many floods, you could tell stories till you died. Floods are all different, like if you get a small one, there's never much worry. One flood, 10 years ago say, it rose so fast that we were in the cow bales and it hit us. It floated the cans, it floated everything out of the bales, and we had to bring a boat in to get my father because he was 86. And by morning it was up to the second guttering of the house. That was a bad flood. Flood in August.
91.
Well, it completely demolished our shed, it demolished our cow bales, it demolished the dairy, demolished the house, took everything.
My name's Darren Blanche, local resident of the Hawkesbury, school captain at Wilberforce Public School, 1978. As a child, we used to walk through what is the abattoirs, M&A Butchery on King Road. Me and my mates used to go down. We had a tree down on the river, and we spent our entire summer holidays jumping out of the tree and trying to hitch a ride behind a ski boat whenever one went past opposite Pitt Town Bottoms. I learned onto an aquaplane board and then stepped onto 2 skis. And then I went from 2 skis to 1 ski, had a crack at barefooting. I footed one day at about 27 years old, went about 500 metres up the river. I went in head first and nearly injured my back, so I thought, well, I've had a crack, I've done it, and that'll do me. We spend a lot of time on the river. We've got a little beach we lease down at Wilberforce called Folks Farm, opposite Percy's place, just down the river from the old Pitt Town Ferry Road. It's a great little spot for us to launch the boat and have barbecues, weekend sleepovers and things like that.
Dyarubbin, thanks for your company. We hope you've enjoyed 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's Pitt Town Lagoon audio walk on Dyarubbin's floodplain.
For more information, please see Hawkesbury Regional Museum's website.
There are 10 other audio walks along Dyarubbin you can listen to.
Napawunya, see you soon.
Remember, Miniga, friends, tread softly on this dreaming. This country is alive with the Gumara, spirit of our Wurrungad ancestors.
We were strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.